Welcome to the second video in the Bubble Beginners Program series. In this video, we'll go over exploring the Bubble interface. So that's both the Bubble editor itself, as well as the various other tabs that Bubble offers. This is extremely important for you to follow along and learn, as when you start developing your application, you just want to make sure that you know where everything is. It'll really speed up your development and make things easy to find. So in this video, we'll really go over everything, and we'll kind of start with the left side here. As you can see, there are a few tabs here on the left side, and this is what Bubble makes super easy for you to navigate across everything you need for your application. The first tab here, called Design, is really how you build out the front end, or the UI, what your users see within your application. The second tab is your Workflow tab. This is how you define actions or logic for your application. An example of this being if the user clicks this button, what should the application do? Everything in terms of actions and logic is stored here in this Workflow tab. Next, you have your Data tab. This is everything to do with storing data within your application. You have Styles, which basically covers reusable styles. So for example, if you have text, right, headlines all throughout your application, you can create one consistent style for headlines just so you're able to use that across your application. It makes things a lot easier for faster development. We have plugins, which will cover these. These are either Bubble plugins or third-party plugins, which extend the functionality of your application. For example, if you want to have in-app payments, you can go ahead and download a Stripe plugin, which unlocks monetization, subscriptions, one-off payments, etc. into your application. Next, we have Settings, which is just your various settings tab for your Bubble application. And then lastly, we have Logs, which is a way for you to monitor your applications, basically your applications, what's going on, right? How well your app is performing. We'll cover this in a later video within this series. So we'll go through all of these one by one. So let's start with the Design tab. Up here at the very top, you can see a nice kind of toolbar. So let's go through these first. Here, where you see Page Index, this is a way for you to look at all of the pages offered within your Bubble application. Index is basically your landing page. If someone types in your domain name, right, google.com, this is the first page that they will see in their application, in your application. Right? So for example, if you go on airbnb.com, you will hit their landing page or their index page. So when you're going to build your application, just make sure that you're aware that index really means the first thing your user will see when they type in your domain name. Now, of course, you have your standard 404, your reset password page, but if you want to create more pages, you can easily do so by clicking Add a New Page, giving it a name. Let's say we'll give it a Home. And of course, you can clone it from another page if you'd like. We'll leave it blank. We'll hit Create. And now Bubble is creating a new page for us. Now you can see we're on page Home here. One thing to note is that whatever page name you give is actually the URL that the user goes to. So for example, this is my home page. This is actually going to be mydomain.com, right? yourdomain.com/home. So when you're naming your pages, just make sure you're aware that the name that you provide is actually the URL that the user will go to. So just suggestion here, give your page names a very clean, short name because it does become a path for your URL. Now, since we're on the topic of pages, if you double click anywhere in the white space here, you will see the page settings. So as you can see, this is home. So I can easily rename it here again. We'll call it dashboard. And you can see it changes the name here as well. We see the page title. So this is actually what you'll see in the browser. So if we call it dashboard, then whenever a user has a tab open, let's say in Chrome or in Firefox, the browser text will actually say dashboard. Now we have a couple more things here. You can go through them. It's pretty self-explanatory. You can change the color, right, of the page itself. It doesn't have to be a color. It can be a gradient, an image, a video, etc. But down here, you can see you can also add SEO settings to the page itself. So definitely recommend going through this, and of course, adding the relevant SEO settings that you'd like for each one of your pages. Now we'll go through the layout as well as conditional tab in a little bit as well. So that's everything you need to know in terms of pages. And of course, we're on the dashboard page now. If we want to go back and now edit our index page, we can do so as well. Now, going over to the right, we see it says pick an element. This is a nice way for you to quickly kind of target your visual elements on the page. So instead of going through the page itself, you can easily just go ahead, go into this drop down and just pick the element that you want to work on. Everything here is pretty self-explanatory, so we would just suggest you to go through them yourself. This little gift box is updates from Bubble. Grids and borders, this is a way for you to kind of add helpful features into your app as you're building. So for example, if you want to be able to kind of design nicely, you can click show grid and you see now you can more pixel perfect design your application. It's not needed, so definitely just go ahead and play with this to see the settings that you'd like. In terms of arrange, this is a way for you to kind of bring elements front to back, align them either horizontally or vertically. So again, just play around with this in your own time as well. You have an undo button and a redo button. So anything that you're doing within Bubble is automatically saved to the cloud. You'll notice that there is no save button anywhere. So feel free to just play along with things, right? I'm dragging this over to the left. I saw a change. Maybe I don't like that, so I'll just click undo and it moves it right back. So just be aware that whatever you do, you can always undo it or redo it, right? Don't be worried that, a one-time change is going to mess up everything. As you can see here, we're actually on a Bubble free plan, so you will need to upgrade your application if you want to deploy it live. But you can also preview your application if you'd like as well, right? So if I click preview, it'll actually open up another tab for me to really see how the application looks in like a live setting. So that's really it for this top navigation bar, kind of toolbar. Definitely suggest you taking 5 to 10 minutes to just look around here and play with it. So that's almost everything with the design tab. Let's quickly go over this UI builder here as well. So here we can see an elements tree. This again is almost the same thing as our drop down here, but it's just another way to show what you have on the page. So if we go ahead and add a button here, you can see that now this button is both in the element tree as well as this drop down here. All right, so as you start to build your application, you'll see elements starting to pop up in this element tree, and it's very easy for you to just kind of open this up and kind of click on what you need to work on. One thing to note is that there is an expanding and collapsing feature here as well. So as you can see, we actually have a group here, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But when you expand the group, you can see the elements that are inside of it. Now, if you start thinking about your application and what you're going to build, be aware that, for a specific page, you might have many, many elements on there. So you want to make sure that you give your elements a name that's easy for you to understand and to come back to later. If I have button A here, button B here, right, and then button C, you can see that in our elements tree, things are starting to get a little complex. So perhaps for button A, we'll change it to say button sign up, right? For button B, we'll have button log out, and button C will say dashboard, right? So this will go to the user's dashboard. So now we can see that our elements tree is getting a little more organized and clean. And if we come back next week to continue building our application, we'll know what this button actually does, right? Because we named it correctly. So definitely give your groups, your visual elements, all of that names that make sense to you. All right, let's go ahead and continue now. So scrolling down here, we can see a couple different headers. The first is visual elements. So here's everything that's offered to you by Bubble without downloading any plugins. So as we can see, we have a text visual element, a button visual element, an icon, and etc. going all the way down. So as you start building your front end, again, what the user sees for your application, this is where you'll go to add all of the visual elements that you need. So here we'll add a text element. And on the right, in the settings for that element, we'll just say, welcome to my application. So here's where we add text to, our application. Now, one thing you'll notice is this pop-up, right? We have this pop-up for text, we have this pop-up for button, we have this pop-up for our large group here, program agenda. So as you notice, every single element, right, every visual element has its own settings. So let's just go through this text settings here. We have the actual text that gets displayed, right? We have a couple of settings here that we can do. So just take a look at those if you need them. Remember, if you have like links, if this is an actual link, we can just say recognize and give it a link color, right? So it's super nice and helpful for our users. Here you see add workflow, so we'll get to that at a later video. This is how you add actions if the user clicks this text element. Now here's where we were talking about styles. This is how you add a style, right, to a specific element. So right now it's under the body style. So if we click edit style, it'll go to this styles tab, right? We can actually just go ahead and click it. And this is what our body style looks like, right? So for example, it's size 14. It uses this specific font, this specific text color, and a couple other settings. So you can go ahead and easily add a style to a text element if you'd like. If you want to make it custom, you can just detach the style itself, and then you'll see it pops up here. So now we can go ahead and make it a larger font size, a different color, right? Word spacing, line spacing, etc. So go ahead and look through what you can do here, right? Take a look at the borders, right? The shadow style, all of that good stuff will let you kind of play around with it. Now, of course, we do have the layout tab here as well. We'll get into that in a little bit. And then we also have conditionals. So I'll just briefly cover conditionals. This is a way for you to, kind of how the name says, conditionally style this text element. So we can say when, and we want to build out our when statement. We'll say when the current user is logged in, right? So the user has created an account on your application and they're logged in. So let's just say the text now should say, and we'll do dynamic data. We'll get to this in a later point, so please don't feel like you don't understand what dynamic data is. But here we'll say text is the current user's email, right? So now when the user is logged in, the text will actually say the current user's email, right? We can click it on and we can see it. Clicking it off, it defaults to the off setting. So if the user isn't logged in, it'll say, welcome to my application. If they are logged in, it'll say, it'll spit out their current email address. So again, hopefully conditionals are starting to make sense to you. We'll go over them in a more detail later when we're doing data retrievals. But just start thinking of all that you can do now with conditional statements. It's a very powerful tool. So that's it in terms of, settings for visual elements and what visual elements are. Of course, just remember, this is what Bubble provides you off the shelf. But of course, you can install more visual elements through plugins. Next, we have containers. Containers are a way for you to, really what the name says here is have like an outer group where you have many different visual elements inside. So for example, we have this group container. That's what this is right here. As I drag this group, every visual element inside gets dragged with it. You can think about this group as just one visual element with others inside of it. So it's a nice way for you to group elements together, keep them housed. It makes your elements tree easier, right? And instead of, let's say I had a conditional expression, right? Conditional expression for my group here. I wouldn't have to do it for this element and this element. Instead, I can just do it to the group itself. So it covers all aspects, right? So for example, I could say when current user is logged in, this element is not visible, right? So we'll uncheck this. So if the user is logged in, this element here, this whole group, just won't be visible. It'll be hidden on the page. So now I don't have to do it for this element. I don't have to do it for this element. I can just do it for the outer group. So it makes things a lot easier in terms of development. Next, we have a repeating group. We'll get into this a little later. This is probably the most complex visual element that you can add within Bubble, but it's also the most powerful. So when you think about an application like Airbnb, where you see all of the listings in a nice grid format, that's really what this element is. It allows you to bring back items from your database and present them in a nice, clear, consistent format. We have a pop-up, which is pretty self-explanatory. We have a floating group. What this does is it basically, as the name suggests, it floats above every other element. So if we add a floating group here, you can see it kind of stuck to the top. And that's because we have float relative to top. Right, we can also change this to bottom. And if we scroll down, we can see it's at the bottom. We can do both, so it kind of gets to be in the middle. Let's just stick it to the top for now. And what you can think about a floating group being is really like that sticky top navigation bar, right? So as a user scrolls down when your application is live, this floating group will actually stay sticky to the top. So as you see many different applications out there today, as the user scrolls down, the navigation bar stays sticky to the top. So this is what we recommend you doing with a floating group. So I'll just go ahead and delete it, and we can continue. Group focus is a way for you to create a group that's relative to another group. So as soon as you add it to your page, you can see it's kind of there. Now you see reference element. This is what you add it to, and then it'll kind of be focused to that element, right? So for example, if we say text program overview, let's go ahead and do it to welcome to my application. So now you see it's kind of sticky to this text right here. And of course we can offset it, right? So we can do -20, that should bring it up. We can do 50, which will bring it down a little bit, right? So you can kind of play around with how you want to offset this focus. But the main purpose of a group focus is to do like an extended menu. So in traditional apps, you see the 3 elliptical kind of icon. If the user clicks that, it kind of opens a sub menu. So that's what we see in terms of group focus. But of course, the options are unlimited. You can use it for other use cases as well. And that's really it in terms of containers. Of course, like visual elements, you can install more through the use of plugins. Next, we have input forms. Now, this is a way, as the name suggests, for you to collect data from your users. Right? You can't really do so with visual elements here. Instead, you'll use input forms. So for example, if we add this input here, this is a way for you to collect data from your users. So the placeholder we might have here is something like first name. So here, the user would just type in their first name, of course. Content format is pretty important, right? So for this input, we really only want text, right? If we had this as integer, this input would only allow the user to enter in numbers, and we don't want that, right? We want the user to enter in their first name, so we'll have it as text. Now, of course, you can have email, right? So now Bubble knows that it should be expecting like an @ symbol, right? And it should be expecting an email. You can have password as well. So this is for sensitive information. It kind of hides it away, right? So password is pretty explanatory. You would have an input field called password and just have the content format as password as well. So take a look here. You can see there are many other different content formats here. So just use the one that you really need. Of course, you can also say this input should not be empty. So if you have a button here, right, that says pretty much something like submit, and you have a workflow associated with it, you can go ahead and make this input should not be empty, which means the workflow will actually not run because this input is blank. So pretty important to know when you want inputs to be for the user to allow them to be empty, or when they are basically required. And then last thing I'll say here is, let's just say we have text. We can also limit the number of characters. So for example, if the user is entering some kind of PIN, right? Well, let's just keep it as text. If the user was entering some kind of PIN, right, maybe it's only a 6-digit PIN, so we'll want the maximum number here, 6, so they don't erroneously put more. So that's it in terms of input forms. Now, of course, you have multi-line input, which is basically just a larger version of the input. You have checkboxes, drop-downs, search boxes, everything here pretty self-explanatory. And again, I'll say the same thing. You can always go ahead and download and install more input forms through the use of plugins. Now, the last thing I'll cover here is reusable elements. So for example, if you had some kind of login pop-up, you can go ahead and create it as a reusable element so you can use it across other pages within your application. Right? If I had one specific sort of, I'll just say the login form, I don't want to create a new login form on every page. Instead, I would just have a reusable element that I use across all of my pages. So definitely take a look at reusable elements as well. So let me go ahead now and just quickly delete all of these elements. I'll hide the program overview. And the last thing to cover in this video is the responsive settings. So if you create an application right now, it's using Bubble's new responsive engine, which is what we'll actually be using throughout this whole program and other programs as well, as this is now the default engine for Bubble. It used to be where you could just drag an element anywhere, and you can still do that now today, but our recommendation is to use Bubble's responsive engine. So if we double click on our page settings, we can see the layout tab here. Now, the reason we're able to drag elements anywhere on the page is that our container layout is set to fixed. Instead, let's go ahead and set it to column. So what does this mean? You can now think of your page as one whole column. So now this program agenda, right, is actually fixated to the very top. And that's because it's set to column, which means if we added a button now, it goes right below the previous element on our page. So on the button now, we can kind of click in layout, and we can make this the previous sort of display element. So now you can see it pushed this program overview group down. We can click next, and now it goes below it. So this is a very nice way of creating an application because it's mobile responsive, tablet responsive, right? Now Bubble knows that this button should basically always be under this group here, no matter the size of the desktop or the mobile resolution. So let's continue talking about responsive settings here. So we see container alignment is set to the top. We can also go ahead and make it centered. So now everything will be pushed to the center. Let's go ahead and add a text element here. And it still is centered, right? Everything gets centered. If we go back here now, we can make it bottom aligned. So now everything aligns to the bottom. Here we can make it space around, which what this does is it basically makes it so you have spacing around your elements, right? Equal spacing in that sense. And then lastly, we can kind of make it space between, which pushes this element to the very top, this element to the very center, and this element at the very bottom. So it wants to put the maximum amount of space between the elements. So definitely start thinking about your layout and your UI and how you want your application to look. And this is how you'll go ahead and start designing the responsive settings. So we'll move this back to the top. And as you can see now, let's take a look at the settings for the various elements inside of the index page here. So for this button, we can see horizontal alignment as well. So here, we might want this button centered, but everything else left aligned. So we can just change the horizontal alignment of this button. Here we can see that this button is right now set to fixed width. Maybe we don't want that. So let's uncheck this, and you can see now the button is actually taking the whole width of the page. So maybe we want that, maybe we don't, right? A button the whole size of the page is kind of ridiculous, right? So maybe we'll just add a max width of 500 pixels. So as the page gets larger, the maximum width that this button can be is 500 pixels in width. Now, as the page gets smaller, the minimum it can be is 425. When you click Fit to Content, this basically makes the width as small as it can be, right? So if we have here, this is my button. Let's go back to layout. Let's make this minimum width 0 in a sense. So now it's fitting to the content, right? It's really fitting to the text of this button. If we go ahead and just have the text say button, we can see it got smaller, right? It's still just fitting to the text. So that's what fit width to content does. It basically shrinks it as most as it can in a sense. We can make the the height fixed as well if we'd like. But the same settings apply to width and height, right? We can make the height static, or we don't have to, right? We can make the minimum width 0 in a sense, and of course, it'll give it the least height that it really needs. Now, right now, we're fitting the height to the content. If we uncheck this, you can see, of course, it makes the button as large as it can be. So when you start thinking about the various visual elements that you have in your application, you'll start to understand that, like, for buttons, for text, you probably don't necessarily want them to have maximum width and height, but other things you might want, right? Like, so for this group right here, you might want this to be a column layout. In the group itself, it might make sense to not have this fixed width, but instead have it just span the whole page, right? And instead, this program overview should just be centered aligned, as well as this sort of extra detail as well. So this is how you can start playing with responsive settings. Now remember, our container layout for the page itself is column, but that doesn't mean that the group inside here needs to be column as well. This can be row. And what row means is that everything just goes across from left to right. So this program overview is on the left side, whereas this extra detail is on the right side. Now here, we don't have to have it like that. We can move program overview to the right. And you can see they just switched places. So one thing to take away here, as I said, the page itself can be column. You can have a group inside that can be row. And now you start to see how you build out your application. So what my suggestion is for responsive settings and just building responsively is for you to really take 20 to 30 minutes and play around with the responsive settings. Just take some nice design from another page, website, or application and try to recreate it using the responsive engine here. There's really a lot you can do. And just from having been a developer on Bubble for a very long time, this responsive engine is much, much better than the legacy responsive settings that Bubble had. It's a little more confusing, but once you understand it, being able to build responsively is a lot faster. So thanks again for watching. This concludes the second video in the Bubble Beginners program series. I hope to see you in video number 3.